Welcome to the revision session for Animal Farm AO2 quotes. Firstly, what is AO2? So AO2 is language. We're writing about words, phrases, techniques. So this means similes, metaphors, personifications, zoomorphism, verbs, nouns, adjectives, lexical choices, all of that. You get marked for commenting on the effect of these words, just like you do with AO1. We're really looking at you talking about what these words mean and what does the writer want us to think? What message is the writer trying to get across by using this simile or metaphor, this technique that they're using? Before I talk about the quotes themselves, let's talk about the structure of an AO2 paragraph. The first thing that you need to do when you come to one of your AO2 paragraphs is that you need to explain clearly how the quote that you've chosen supports your wider response. In other words, how does the quote that you've chosen help you to answer the question? After you've done this, you then need to very quickly name the main technique that the writer is using. If that's a simile, then start by saying the writer uses the simile, and then the third thing you're going to do is actually write the quote out. After you've got that, so you've got your big quote at the top, you're going to then explain what that quote means in a nice clear sentence, just to show the examiner that you understand the quote. Then after that, you're going to fully explain every part of that quote. Every word and phrase within the quote that you think is significant, you're going to explain. You're going to reuse terminology when you can. You're going to perhaps identify the word classes as you go. The point being, you're going to use as many techniques as you can throughout the AO2 paragraph to really signpost to your examiner, this is an AO2 paragraph. I'm talking about language here. You want to also try to make links where you can back to the question. If you look on the right hand side of the screen, you can see that basically an AO2 paragraph is technique, quote, explain, 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 explain. In its simplest form, that's what it is. It's to qui. Just remember that at the start of this paragraph, you want to absolutely make a connection to the question. So if the question happens to be on the pigs as leaders, for example, you're going to say that the writer uses this technique to help you explain that big question. So when you're writing your AO2 paragraph, you want to try and use as much terminology as possible. Start with the big piece of terminology at the very start, and then as you move through, keep trying to identify word classes, keep trying to identify any other techniques that come up so that you're, again, making it really clear to the examiner, this is an AO2 paragraph, I'm analysing language. Make sure you explain your ideas fully. When there's a lot to write and you're under a time limit, it can be really easy to go, oh, this just means this. But you need to explain, use the word because to explain to your examiner what your idea means. Try and make links to context when they're relevant. Try to make links to the question, like I said in the previous slide, try to make links to the question as often as you possibly can. A big mistake that sometimes students make that we want to avoid is that if we feel that our quote definitely answers part of the question, but not everything about this quote fits in with the theme of the question, it doesn't matter. As long as you make a link to the question, and you're doing that as often as you can then write everything else about this quote. Try to start with your more straightforward ideas, the simpler ideas, and then use the cleverer ideas towards the end of your paragraph. That's important because by starting simple and becoming more complicated, you're building your answer. You're starting small and you're getting bigger and bigger. If I start with a big idea first and then I get less clever as I go through, my examiner might not be as convinced I know what I'm saying. The first quote we're going to do is all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. This is a really important quote. It's one that captures so many of Orwell's ideas in one piece of language. So the first thing that we're going to say about this piece of language is that it's paradoxical language. So that's the big technique we'll use at the start of our paragraph. It's paradoxical because it contains two statements that contradict each other. All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal. Those two things don't make sense when you put them together. That's really important because it reveals that the pigs are being deceptive, that they're also being quite clever using language, and that it's a demonstration of the corruption of their power. The first part of the quote, all animals are equal, seems like a complete and absolute statement. It seems very convincing and it seems very fair. All animals are equal seems like a very fair statement. But this is an example of the language being superficial, meaning it's only surface deep, because literally as soon as it's finished, there's a comma and we're going to move on to the idea that that's not actually true. So this is a subversion of equality. Now, equality, from the word equal there, is a democratic idea. Now, democratic comes from the Greek word demos and kratia. Demos meaning people, kratia meaning power. So democracy almost literally means the power of the people. So equality is a really important idea in a democratic society, that people in that society, the people should have the power and we should all be equal. This is seen by much of the world as an ideal, as the bedrock, the foundation of a fair society. However, this is a commandment, this is an instruction given to the pigs, from the pigs to the other animals, and that completely contradicts equality. It completely contradicts the idea that all animals are equal. So the first word that we're going to look at is all. So all is a pronoun. So when we're writing this, we'll write that all is a pronoun. All is a pronoun that encompasses everybody. It seems to include everybody. And that seems to have been the original vision of the farm. When we think about when animalism was first constructed, all meant everybody. Everybody was supposed to be equal. Old Major talked about everybody being equal. However, this raises the question, has that ever really been true? Because animalism was designed by a small group of animals and given to the rest. And Old Major was on a platform in a bed of straw, having lived a long and healthy life in a barn where animals were in kind of hierarchical order. So it does raise the question, was that equality ever really true? The second word, animals, reminds us that this is an allegory. This book is an allegory, which means that all of the characters represent an idea or a character from the real world. So humans in this case. Now in Russia, all humans were supposed to be equal, but later the proletariat became less equal. Same on Animal Farm. They were all equal to start with, or thought they were at least, and as time has gone on, they are now less equal. So animals is an interesting word to use because animals are often controlled by an instinct. They follow a herd, they follow a pack, they often don't have much independent thought, they work as a group. And so many of these animals almost have followed the pigs almost without thinking. So then we come to the word but, which is a conjunction. The word but alters or inverts tone in a sentence. That's its job. And so it indicates really clearly that what we believed in the first part of the statement is actually not true. Then we come to the determiner some. So we had all animals and now we have some animals. This suggests a small number then. Some suggests a small number, a privileged few, a small group of animals with more rights. It's a complete contradiction of the earlier statement, and it's a corruption of the message of animalism. Obviously, there's another allegory here. Animalism is an allegory for communism, and it mirrors the corruption of communism in Soviet Russia. As the book progresses, the pigs become more like people and less like animals. This is a technique we call anthropomorphizing. So the pigs have been anthropomorphized, which makes them seem more human. By the end, they are wearing clothes, standing on their hind legs. They're not animals then in the definition provided here. Yes, I know that humans are animals as well, but we often talk about humans and animals as separate, and the pigs are no longer animals in this sense. The next part of the quote is more equal. This is an oxymoron. You can't have something that is more equal, because equal doesn't mean that. You can't have something that is more or less if it's equal. This then is paradoxical language, which is designed to be unclear. It yet again talks about this idea of a privileged class, a small group of people or animals who are separate from the others, which corrupts and kind of subverts animalism, and the others, the bigger group, whose rights have been eroded. Now, this language obfuscates, which means it hides and conceals its meaning, which confuses the reader. It doesn't make a lot of sense. And it superficially, on the surface level, upholds equality, but it also enables those who are in power to justify their power and justify their ends, their designs. Now, equality is not possible when you have power that is distributed unequally like this. When you have a small group with more power than another group, that is not equality. This idea as well is a revision. The original commandment was all animals are equal. Now it says this extra, but some animals are more equal than others. So it's a revisionist idea, which means that somebody's gone back over the past and they've changed the information to make it fit what they want. So revisionist ideas betray this original idea of animalism and betray the idea of equality. A bit of context that's useful for this quote is the idea of the reduction of language. Now, I know that what this looks like is originally it was more animals are equal and then some words have been added, but actually all of the other commandments have been removed for just this. This reduction of language is important because Orwell believed that a reduction of language led to a reduction of ideas and of thinking, and that meant that you could be controlled more easily, that people could use that to manipulate others. The book he wrote after Animal Farm, 1984, is all about the idea of removing words from the dictionary to make it easier to control people. Now, this statement then leaves no room for argument. There were 7 commandments, now there's 1. They've been made simpler, a smaller idea that's easier to understand and has no room really for argument. If you think about the complete system of thought that the pigs originally created from Old Major's ideas, this is a reduction of that idea. Now, the commandments, and this is a commandment, they were originally capitalized in the text, but as they lose their importance throughout the book, that capitalization is lost. Their importance is eroded. They're reduced from a complex system of thought, then reduced to 7, then they're reduced to a slogan for the animals that can't understand, 4 legs good, 2 legs bad, and then they're revised finally to this one idea that all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. When you're writing about this quote, you will want to make a link to the question that you've been asked at the start. This is a brilliant quote then because it links to every possible question that could come up. If the question is about power or leadership or both, well, this quote is language that's used by the people in power or the pigs in power to control others. If the question happens to be about corruption, well, this quote is about control and it subverts animalism. It's about tricking the animals. If the question's about equality, well, this quote talks about equality. It uses equality in a very kind of paradoxical way, and it actually removes equality from society. If it's about the power of language, well, the language here is very clever. It's used to hide, to obfuscate the truth, to gain power and to gain control. If rebellion happens to be the question or the theme of the question, or this quote subverts that idea. This quote's being used to prevent rebellion. The original rebellion was sought as a form of freedom for the animals to try to remove the oppression of Farmer Jones, but now they are just as oppressed as before. If the question happens to be education and intelligence, well, without proper education, without intelligence, the pigs have been able to gain control over these less educated animals because the pigs are the only ones who really have an education and have intelligence. The next big quote that you perhaps want to revise for Animal Farm is, all that year the animals worked like slaves. There's a picture there of the Egyptians building the pyramids and the slaves. That is important in relation to this quote. We'll come to that later. So in all that year the animals worked like slaves, the first thing we'll write is that it is a simile. Now it's actually a very clever simile because a simile is where you obviously compare two things using like or as. So it suggests that they are like slaves. They're not really slaves, they're just a bit like slaves. But in actual fact, if you look at what's going on the farm, if you look at the way they're having to work, it would probably be more accurate just to describe them as being slaves. So this is all about perception and how they don't think they're really slaves, but they probably are. Now, slaves is a noun, and I think it's probably one of the most important words in this quote, because slaves have masters. So there's a clear discrepancy in power here. Slaves have masters, and in this case, it is the pigs that fulfill that role. Slaves are property. They're not considered people, or in this case, animals. It dehumanizes people. When people are slaves, they are no longer human. Their human rights have been removed from them. And the animals are the same. Their rights have been removed from them. The other thing is that slaves are utterly powerless and oppressed. They have no power of their own to change their way of life. Slaves live an extremely hard life, and Old Major promised the end of slavery. It was something he said in the first chapter, and yet the values he spoke of are clearly subverted here. The original idea of animalism isn't working. The next thing we can say about slaves is that they work for no reward. They've got no choice. Now, structurally, this has an echo of Mr. Jones. He was their master in the first chapter, and now the pigs have taken over that role. They're effectively prisoners, and they're trapped in this cycle of exploitation, whether it's Jones or the pigs. Slaves are trapped. They're rarely freed from servitude, which suggests that they're going to be trapped in this cycle potentially forever. Now, slavery is a motif, which means an image that recurs several times during the book. Sometimes there are pages where we'll see that as a semantic field, where lots of words linking to slavery are used in the same space in a text. And this motif is established during chapter 1, and then the animals rebel, so you would hope that that motif would disappear, but in actual fact it becomes more prevalent throughout the text. Now, very similar to our last quote, we've got all and we've got animals. So first of all is a pronoun, it's encompassing, which makes it seem really absolute. So it suggests that every animal is included in this, and none of them are spared the hardship. There's nobody who gets away with it, and it feels like it's all animals all of the time. But that's unreliable because the pigs aren't included in that. They are not part of that group that are working like slaves. And it's the same with the word animals. It's a noun and it's a homogeneous word, which means all of the animals are kind of clumped together. It doesn't matter whether you're a horse or a donkey or a sheep, you are just an animal, which again suggests that the pigs should be part of that, but they're not. Again, they're separate. And much like in All Animals Are Equal, as the book goes on, animals are more and more anthropomorphized, meaning they're made more like humans, and so they are not animals in the sense that this quote means animals. The word year is interesting because if you think about how long animals live versus humans, a year is actually a very long time in an animal's life, much longer than it would be for us. So it seems like there's no respite, there's no escape from this, it is just all the time. Now, from a contextual point of view, in the Soviet Russia, Stalin had 5-year plans which enforced work quotas. Now, these work quotas meant that the people of Russia had quite a lot of hardship, and the 5-year plans often failed as well. Orwell was a critic of totalitarianism, a kind of leadership style where there is an absolute rule, and he was a big proponent of socialism, meaning that society is built around people more so. And this quote absolutely captures some of his attitudes. Finally, the breaking of the stones in chapter 6 has some allusions to the ancient Egyptian slaves who built the pyramids, structures that took years to build, that cost huge amounts of resources, and they were really just there to glorify one person. So they were a symbol of power and decadence over others. And the animals being slaves here and the windmill starts to feel very much like it's about that, particularly when Napoleon chooses to name the windmill the Napoleon windmill. So if we're going to write about this quote, we're going to have a think about the themes that might come up in a question. If it's about power and leadership, well, slavery is about the powerful oppressing the powerless. So the pigs are exerting that power. If the question happens to be about corruption, well, slavery is about taking away rights and treating people as a resource, dehumanizing them. Equality, this is obviously about a society that is not equal because slaves, any society where there are slaves, cannot be equal. The power of language, again, the animals have come about to being slaves because they haven't understood the power the pigs have over them, primarily through their words, their speeches, their propaganda. Rebellion. Rebellions are about freedom, or the rebellion was about fighting for freedom. And this quote reveals that there is still no freedom, still no equality. And similar to the power of language, if the question's about education and intelligence, if the animals had been educated, they would be able to see that they are not like slaves, they effectively are slaves. The next quote is less a quote, and it's a series of smaller quotes. But from an AO2 point of view, this is about a style that Orwell uses. We're going to talk about the passive voice, parenthesis, and the unreliable narrator. Now, there are 3 quotes which are an example of these 3 techniques being used. At the start of your AO2 paragraph, you're going to talk about Orwell's narrative style rather than write these 3 quotes out all at once, because you'll write these quotes out when you need to analyse them. When you introduce your AO2 paragraph, you'll make the link to whatever the theme is, and then you'll say, as your quote, you'll talk about passive voice, parenthesis, and unreliable narrator, and then you'll launch into an example of these. So the first quote that we'll look at, or the first technique that we'll look at, is passive voice. It was noticed that the milk had disappeared. So passive voice here is about the milk disappearing. No one is taking the milk. It's not a person. There's no active voice there. It's just, it had disappeared. Now, no single individual there has to take responsibility for it. If the sentence were in the active voice, we'd expect an individual or somebody to speak up or question where it had gone. If it said Napoleon had taken the milk, then at that point we can argue with him, we can speak up against him. But by using the passive voice, it directly implies that the animals are passive, something that Orwell criticises heavily throughout the book, because if the animals hadn't been passive, then it's very unlikely that the pigs would have been able to gain the control that they did. The verb disappeared is interesting because it reflects the animal's lack of understanding. The milk has been taken, it has been stolen, but by saying disappeared, it makes it seem like they can't possibly imagine where it could have gone. We, the reader, are very aware, but it shows how passive the animals are. It also shows that they've got a willingness to accept that this has happened, that the milk has just disappeared, and it foreshadows their reluctance to question things. And as things get worse for them, they don't question, they don't challenge any unfairness. And Napoleon and the other pigs capitalise on that. They use that to their advantage. Now, in this quote, of course, milk is a symbol for want. It's not necessary. The animals don't need it, but it is desirable. So it suggests luxury and that some animals have this unnecessary luxury emphasises the failure of animalism. Now, from a structural point of view, which is obviously an AO2 technique as well, it's interesting that this occurs in the same chapter as the rebellion. Orwell is showing us that the revolution was doomed to fail from the very beginning, because the moment they've rebelled, we have Napoleon taking the milk. He even wrote, "I meant the moral to be that revolutions only effect a radical improvement when the masses, the people, are alert and know how to chuck out their leaders as soon as the latter have done their job. The turning point of the story was supposed to be when the pigs kept the milk and apples for themselves." So Orwell absolutely meant this to be the case. If the leaders of the rebellion have got what they want, people need to know when to remove those leaders once those leaders have done their job. Old Major warns in chapter 1 that every drop of milk has gone down the throats of our enemies. Now that suggests that those who take milk are enemies. And yet when Napoleon takes the milk, the animals don't protest. They don't really realise what's happened, or they think of the pigs as animals and mistakenly believe them to be allies. The next technique we're going to talk about is Orwell's use of parenthesis, which is where you use brackets, commas, or dashes to move a part of the sentence into a subordinate clause, almost like you're moving it to one side and it's almost a secondary piece of information. The animals remembered, or thought they remembered. So in that statement there, that or thought they remembered creates uncertainty, a sense the animals aren't really sure. Now, without that extra clause, that subordinate clause, the animals might seem quite certain. If you say the animals remembered, it makes them much more difficult to convince. By saying or thought they remembered, it suggests that they have doubts, and the pigs capitalise on these doubts. They can easily convince them what they thought was true is actually incorrect. Orwell uses this repeatedly through the book, and he wants us to recognise that the animals probably do know that the pigs aren't being entirely honest, but they allow themselves to be convinced. Almost as with the passive voice, the animals are being kind of passive. The animals need education in order to articulate themselves better, to write down things for future reference. Because the pigs control language, particularly written language, they control history, they control the narrative as well. The other technique that Orwell uses regularly is the unreliable narrator, and that often comes with a lot of irony as well. Nobody stole, nobody grumbled, nobody shirked. When he says this, it's clearly not true, because nobody stole, the pigs are stealing the milk and apples. Nobody grumbled, well, animals are grumbling. Nobody shirked, the pigs aren't working hard, so they are shirking their responsibilities. The use of anaphora, this repetition of nobody, 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 creates a sense that the animals are united through animalism and everyone is working together for a shared goal, because nobody's stealing, nobody's grumbling, nobody's shirking. It creates a contrast that suggests that stealing, grumbling and shirking, that did take place under Jones. Animalism's better then because none of this stuff's happening. But because this comes shortly after the pigs have taken the milk, it's ironic. It's an unreliable statement. It's not really true. Because the pigs have stolen, but they've explained to the animals why they need the milk and apples, and they do shirk work because they convince the other animals that they need to supervise. We can see that structurally we're seeing that the animals are incredibly naive. Orwell establishes this unreliable narrator to show us that they're an outsider to the pigs. This narrator is not able to fully understand what's happening on the farm and what the pigs are doing. And by doing this narrative style allows us, the reader, to be completely immersed in their world and see things from the animal's perspective, not the pig's perspective, but the other animals. Now, Orwell wants us, the reader, to question everything the animals are told. Now that reflects his lack of trust in leaders and his desire for us, the reader, to question what we're told in the real world by leaders. So let's have a talk about the kinds of themes that might come up in the question and how we can use Orwell's narrative techniques to answer it. So if power and leadership's the theme, then these quotes are brilliant. The idea of Orwell's techniques are all about how leaders who are dishonest and try to trick others don't have our best interests at heart. If corruption's the question, well, all of this is about the erosion of rights, the ignorance of animals to the pig's corruption. If equality is the question, yet again, the techniques he uses hide and obfuscate the true nature of the farm, the erosion of animals' equality. If power of language comes up, then this is an amazing set of quotes to use because they're all about language and how it can be used to gain power and how people can be disempowered by it. If rebellion comes up as a question, very similar to other quotes, this is all about the erosion of rights, how equality and other aspects of the animals' lives have been taken by the pigs, and it goes against the principles of the original rebellion. And then education and intelligence. Without education, the animals are ignorant to the truth. Their rights are taken from them. Orwell is arguing without education, we're vulnerable to oppression. And those are the three, probably the biggest quotes that you'll want to revise for Animal Farm.